The December wind cut through the airfield like a razor, carrying with it the smell of aviation fuel and the distant rumble of B-17 engines warming up for another mission over Germany. Staff Sergeant Tommy Brennan stood alone near the radio shack at Thorpe Abbott's Air Base in East Anglia, England, his breath forming small clouds in the frozen morning air. At 22 years old, he looked younger than most of the men in his squadron, with freckles still visible across his nose and hands that trembled slightly as he wound copper wire around a makeshift antenna core. Around him, the base buzzed with the controlled chaos of pre-mission preparation. Ground crews swarmed over the massive bombers like ants, checking engines, loading ammunition belts, and painting fresh nose art on fuselages still scarred from previous runs. Pilots huddled in their briefing rooms, studying maps and weather reports, while bombardiers calibrated their Norden bomb sights with religious precision. Everyone had their role, their place in the great machine of war. Everyone except Tommy. He had arrived at Thorpe Abbott's 3 months earlier with dreams of glory and a head full of technical knowledge from radio school in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. His instructors had praised his natural aptitude for electronics, his ability to diagnose signal problems that left other students baffled. He could strip and reassemble a liaison radio set blindfolded, tune frequencies with the precision of a concert pianist, and troubleshoot interference patterns that seemed like witchcraft to others. But here, in the real war, none of that seemed to matter. The problem was simple and devastating. German flak batteries had become terrifyingly accurate. The 88mm anti-aircraft guns that dotted the European landscape were no longer firing blind patterns into the sky, hoping to catch a bomber in their explosive net. They had radar now, primitive by later standards but effective enough to track the massive B-17s as they lumbered toward their targets at 25,000 feet. The Würzburg radar systems could paint a bomber's position with enough accuracy to direct flak shells within deadly proximity. The results were catastrophic. Mission after mission, Tommy watched bombers limp back to base with gaping holes in their fuselages, or worse, never return at all. Just last week, a fort from the 351st Bomb Group had taken a direct hit over Schweinfurt, breaking apart in midair and sending 10 men tumbling toward Earth. Only 3 parachutes had opened. Tommy had tried to help. God, how he had tried. He spent his off hours in the radio shack, poring over technical manuals and German intelligence reports, trying to understand how the enemy radar worked. He sketched diagrams, ran calculations, and tested theories on dummy antennas built from scrap wire and tin cans. His commanding officer, Major Richard Hartwell, had initially shown interest in his enthusiasm. That interest had died quickly. 3 weeks ago, Tommy had presented his first idea to the Major, a modification to the B-17's radio antenna that he believed might deflect or scatter the radar signals tracking the bombers. Hartwell had listened for exactly 4 minutes before cutting him off. "You are a radioman, Sergeant, not an engineer," the Major had said, his voice cold enough to match the December wind outside. "We have scientists at MIT and experts at the War Department working on these problems. What we need from you is to keep the radios working so our boys can call for help when they get shot down. Stick to your job." The dismissal had stung, but Tommy had persisted. He refined his idea, built a working prototype, and requested another meeting. This time, Hartwell had not even looked at the device. "This is pathetic, Brennan," the Major had said, gesturing dismissively at the twisted wire antenna Tommy had spent 2 weeks perfecting. "You have taken spare parts without authorization, wasted time that should have been spent on maintenance, and produced something that looks like it belongs in a junkyard, not on a bomber. Consider yourself officially warned. Another stunt like this, and you will find yourself digging latrines for the rest of the war." That had been 5 days ago. Since then, Tommy had kept his head down, maintaining radios and avoiding eye contact with anyone above the rank of corporal. But the antenna sat in his footlocker, wrapped in an oily rag, and every night when he closed his eyes, he saw those 3 parachutes floating down over Schweinfurt. He knew his idea could work. He just needed someone to listen. The humiliation came 3 days later, during the morning briefing for a mission to Bremen. Tommy had been summoned to the operations room to check a faulty intercom system in one of the briefing radios. He worked quietly in the corner while Colonel James Patterson, the group commander, outlined the mission details. 200 bombers would hit the submarine pens and industrial facilities. Intelligence reported heavy flak concentrations along the approach route. As the briefing concluded, Lieutenant Marcus Webb, a pilot from the 418th Squadron, raised his hand. "Sir, what about countermeasures for the German radar? My crew lost their waist gunner over Osnabrück last month because those 88s knew exactly where we were. Are we just supposed to fly straight into it again?" Colonel Patterson's jaw tightened. "We are working with the best minds in the country on radar countermeasures, Lieutenant. Until then, we maintain formation discipline and rely on our fighter escorts." That was when Captain Gerald Morrison, the squadron signals officer and Major Hartwell's closest ally, decided to make an example. "Actually, Colonel, we do have an expert on radar countermeasures right here in this room." His voice dripped with sarcasm as he pointed at Tommy. "Sergeant Brennan believes he has solved the problem with some twisted wire and a prayer. Perhaps he would like to present his solution to the group?" The room fell silent. 40 pairs of eyes turned toward Tommy, who felt his face burning as if he had stepped into a blast furnace. Major Hartwell sat in the front row, his expression unreadable. "Well, Sergeant?" Colonel Patterson's voice was not unkind, but it carried the weight of command. "If you have something to contribute, now would be the time." Tommy's mouth went dry. He had not asked for this, had not wanted this public spectacle. But he thought of the waist gunner Lieutenant Webb had mentioned, thought of the 3 parachutes, thought of all the men who would fly to Bremen today with German radar painting targets on their backs. He stood up, his legs feeling like water. "Sir, I have been studying the Würzburg radar systems. They operate on a specific wavelength, and I believe a modified antenna configuration on our aircraft could scatter the incoming radar signal, making us harder to track. I built a prototype that could be tested." Captain Morrison laughed, a harsh sound that echoed off the operations room walls. "Harder to track? This kid thinks he is smarter than the scientists at MIT. Show them your prototype, Brennan. Let everyone see what passes for engineering in your world." Tommy retrieved the antenna from his bag, his hands shaking as he held it up. To most of the men in the room, it looked like exactly what Major Hartwell had called it. Pathetic. Twisted copper wire wound around an aluminum core, with irregular spacing that seemed random, almost childish. The laughter started small, a few chuckles from the back rows, then spread like wildfire through the briefing room. Pilots nudged each other, pointing at the crude device in Tommy's trembling hands. One bombardier whispered loud enough for everyone to hear, "Looks like something my kid would make in shop class." Colonel Patterson raised his hand for silence, but the damage was done. Tommy felt smaller than he had ever felt in his life, standing there in front of the men he had hoped to help, holding an invention they saw as a joke. Captain Morrison was not finished. "With all due respect, Colonel, we cannot afford to waste time on amateur hour. These men have a mission in 3 hours. Brennan should return to his actual duties before he embarrasses himself further." Tommy opened his mouth to defend his work, to explain the mathematics behind the antenna's irregular spacing, the way the twisted configuration would create destructive interference with the radar wavelength. But the words died in his throat. What was the point? Nobody would listen. He was turning to leave when a voice cut through the room like a knife. "Wait, Lieutenant David Chun?" A B-17 pilot with 16 missions under his belt stood up from his seat in the 3rd row. Unlike the others, he was not smiling. His aircraft, Lucky Dragon, had taken heavy flak damage on 5 separate occasions, and his co-pilot still walked with a limp from shrapnel wounds sustained over Hamburg. Chun walked forward and took the antenna from Tommy's hands, examining it closely. His fingers traced the irregular wire spacing, the careful twists, the precise angles. After a long moment, he looked up at Colonel Patterson. "Sir, with your permission, I would like to test this on today's mission." The room erupted. Captain Morrison shot to his feet, his face reddening. "You cannot be serious, Chun. This is completely unauthorized equipment. If it interferes with your radio communications, you could endanger your entire crew." But Chun did not waver. His eyes met Tommy's, and something passed between them, an understanding that transcended rank and protocol. I trust Brennan's work more than I trust another mission flying blind into radar-guided flak. If he says this might help, I am willing to bet my life on it. Colonel Patterson studied both men for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Very well, Lieutenant. Install it on Lucky Dragon. Brennan, you will personally oversee the installation and test all radio functions before takeoff. If there is any interference whatsoever, the device comes off. Understood? Yes, sir. Tommy's voice cracked with emotion. If you are rooting for Tommy right now, take a moment and subscribe to the channel. This story is about to take a turn nobody saw coming, and you will not want to miss what happens next. Tommy worked faster than he had ever worked in his life. His fingers, no longer trembling, moved with surgical precision as he mounted the modified antenna onto Lucky Dragon's fuselage. Lieutenant Chun stood beside him, watching every connection, every adjustment. The rest of Chen's crew gathered around, their skepticism evident but their trust in their pilot absolute. Radio check, Tommy said, climbing into the aircraft to test the communication system. Chen's radio operator, Sergeant Mike O'Reilly, put on his headset and began running through frequencies. Every channel came through crystal clear, no interference, no distortion. O'Reilly gave Tommy a thumbs up, his expression shifting from doubt to cautious optimism. 2 hours later, Lucky Dragon lifted off from Thorpe Abbotts as part of a 200-bomber formation heading toward Bremen. Tommy watched from the control tower, his heart pounding so hard he thought it might break through his chest. Major Hartwell stood nearby, his arms crossed, his face unreadable. Captain Morrison had refused to even attend, calling the entire exercise a dangerous waste of time. The bombers disappeared into the gray December sky, and all Tommy could do was wait. The mission lasted 6 hours, each minute feeling like an eternity. Tommy sat in the radio shack, monitoring frequencies, listening to scattered transmissions. He heard pilots calling out flak positions, heard the distant thunder of anti-aircraft fire through their open microphones, heard the controlled panic in voices as bombers took hits and fell from formation. But he heard nothing from Lucky Dragon. The silence was terrifying. Had the antenna failed? Had it interfered with their systems at a critical moment? Had Chen's faith in him gotten his crew killed? Then, as the winter sun began its descent toward the horizon, the bombers started returning. Tommy ran to the flight line, scanning the sky with desperate eyes. One by one, the forts touched down, many trailing smoke, some with visible battle damage, their aluminum skins torn and punctured. And then he saw it. Lucky Dragon, approaching the runway clean, no smoke, no visible damage, flying as smoothly as if it had been on a training run. The bomber touched down perfectly, and as it taxied toward its hardstand, Tommy ran alongside it, tears streaming down his face. The aircraft came to a stop, engines winding down, and Lieutenant Chun emerged from the cockpit hatch. His face was transformed, not with relief, but with something approaching reverence. Chun jumped down and grabbed Tommy by the shoulders. The flak was all around us, concentrated like nothing I have ever seen. Shells were exploding everywhere, close enough to rock the aircraft. But not one came near us. It was like we were invisible. Tommy, whatever you did, it worked. My crew is alive because of you. Word spread through Thorpe Abbotts like electricity through copper wire. Within an hour, every pilot on the base wanted to hear Chen's story firsthand. The lieutenant stood in the operations room, still in his flight suit, describing how Lucky Dragon had flown through a gauntlet of flak that should have shredded them. We were over the target, Chun said, his voice steady but filled with conviction. The formation around us was getting torn apart. I watched Big Mike take a direct hit to the number 3 engine. Southern Belle lost half her tail section. But our aircraft? Nothing. The flak bursts were happening hundreds of yards away from us, like the gunners could not get a read on our position. It was not luck. It was Brennan's antenna. Colonel Patterson stood at the front of the room, listening intently. Beside him, Major Hartwell looked like a man who had swallowed broken glass. Captain Morrison had disappeared entirely, unwilling to witness his judgment being proven so catastrophically wrong. How many aircraft did we lose today? Patterson asked his operations officer. 14, sir. Another 23 sustained major damage. But Lucky Dragon came back without a scratch. The colonel turned to Tommy, who stood near the back of the room, still unable to fully process what was happening. Sergeant Brennan stepped forward. Tommy walked to the front on legs that felt disconnected from his body. Patterson's expression was grave, but his eyes held something Tommy had not seen before: respect. Sergeant, I owe you an apology. We all do. You came to us with a solution, and we dismissed you as an amateur playing with junk. Instead, you may have just saved countless lives. Effective immediately, I am ordering every B-17 in this group to be equipped with your antenna modification. Furthermore, I am sending a full technical report to 8th Air Force Headquarters with a recommendation that this becomes standard equipment across all bomber groups. The room erupted in applause. Pilots who had laughed at Tommy hours earlier now crowded around him, shaking his hand, clapping his back. Lieutenant Webb, who had lost his waist gunner over Osnabrück, had tears in his eyes as he thanked him. But it was Chun who pulled Tommy aside as the celebration continued. You know what you did, right? He said quietly. You did not just build an antenna. You proved that one person with courage and conviction can change the course of a war. Do not ever let anyone make you feel small again. Over the next 2 weeks, every bomber at Thorpe Abbotts received Tommy's modification. The results were undeniable. Losses from Flak dropped by 63%. Aircraft that once limped home riddled with holes now returned intact. The twisted wire antenna that Major Hartwell had called pathetic was saving hundreds of lives. Tommy Brennan was no longer the kid they ignored. He was the Radioman who had made B-17s invisible to death itself. March 1946. Washington, D.C. Tommy Brennan stood in the Pentagon's Hall of Heroes, wearing the crisp uniform of a newly promoted technical sergeant, a Distinguished Service Medal pinned to his chest. The war had been over for nearly a year, but its echoes still reverberated through these marble corridors. Beside him stood Lieutenant Colonel David Chun, who had survived 28 missions and was now working at the War Department's Research Division. They were waiting for a meeting with General Carl Spaatz, Commanding General of the Army Air Forces, who wanted to personally thank the men whose innovation had changed aerial warfare. Tommy's antenna modification, initially dismissed as pathetic junk, had been installed on over 12,000 bombers by war's end. Army Air Force's analysis estimated it had reduced flak casualties by 58% and saved approximately 18,000 airmen's lives. MIT engineers had studied his design, refined it, and incorporated its principles into post-war radar countermeasures that would influence aviation technology for decades. But the numbers were not what Tommy thought about anymore. He thought about the letters. Hundreds of them, from pilots and crew members who had made it home because German radar could not find them. From wives who still had husbands, children who still had fathers, mothers who still had sons. Each letter was a life that continued, a future that existed because a 22-year-old Radioman had refused to give up when everyone told him he was wasting his time. Major Hartwell had quietly retired in July 1945, never quite recovering from the professional embarrassment of dismissing what became one of the war's most significant technical innovations. Captain Morrison had been transferred to a desk job in Kansas, far from anyone who remembered his mockery in that December briefing room. Chun nudged Tommy as General Spatz's aide appeared to escort them inside. You ready for this? Tommy smiled, thinking back to that frozen morning at Thorpe Abbotts, standing alone by the radio shack with his twisted wire and his impossible dream. I have been ready since December 1944. After the meeting, Tommy and Chun walked through the Pentagon's corridors, past photographs of bombers in formation, past memorials to fallen airmen. They stopped at a window overlooking the Potomac River, watching the spring sunlight dance on the water. You know what I learned from all this? Tommy said quietly. It does not matter if people call your ideas pathetic or impossible. What matters is whether you believe in them enough to keep fighting when everyone else has given up. Chin nodded. The world needs more radio men like you, Brennan. People who see problems and build solutions instead of excuses. Tommy thought about all the young engineers and technicians out there, working in obscurity, dismissed by people who could not see beyond their own assumptions. He hoped they would hear this story and understand that innovation does not require permission, only courage.